So first of all, I'm very sorry to say that Sanjay Khandra is not feeling well, so she's not going to be joining the panel this morning. Hopefully she'll recover quickly and still be at the conference, and you'll be able to visit with her. So Heidi Nevin has graciously agreed to step in with about an hour and a half notice. So be kinder to her than you would have otherwise. So each day of this 3-day conference is very nicely given a theme. Translators, translating, and translators, translating, transmission, right? Translations. I don't know what the theme is, but it's wonderful. So today we have translator, translation, transmission is the name of this panel then, right? Translator and intention. I'm sorry, I wrote it all down wrong. Okay, so we're starting with the topic of the translator, the who, the what, and the why. Why translate? Why does one choose, or how does one choose what to translate? And the question that's always hanging over us, I think, in translation is transmission inherent in that work? Is that a separate thing? So before I introduce everyone, let me talk about the format of the panel. Each speaker will speak for 10 minutes. And then have another 10 minutes to either elaborate or respond to the previous 3 speakers' presentations. The idea is a conversation between these 4 translators. For questions, you all have some of these cards in your bags. There's more out in the lobby, and a couple of volunteers are going to can give them to you if you need them. They will be collecting them. As soon as you have a question you want to just raise your hand or hand it down to the end of the aisle, and they will be collected and given to Dominique Townsend, who will then be very quietly feeding them to me, and I will be putting them to the translators. The idea is to keep the focus here, but to engage conversation with everyone in the room. I do not have Sanjay Khandra to introduce, so I'm going to introduce Woolston Fletcher. Woolston Fletcher, a founder of the Padmakara translation group and a recipient of several well-deserved awards for his work, brings attention to the need for fluency in both the original and the target languages. I've heard him say several times that the translator has to put it into real English or Spanish or French, not jargon or some new rendering of Tibetan with English words. It's not an actual translation, and it's not terribly useful. I'm glad to hear him. I'm glad to have him speak today on why this is so difficult to accomplish. Anne Klein is professor of religious studies at Rice University and a founding teacher at Dawn Mountain Center for Tibetan Buddhism. She has written on Dzogchen from both the Buddhist and the Bön traditions and has published English language liturgies for the practitioner. Having done so, she can raise for us fascinating issues regarding the responsibility of the translator to be aware of her own language and culture, and to help the reader both understand the culture and the meaning of the text, and to appreciate the flexibility of translation. Readers and students, she said, want a degree of certainty that is not always possible or realistic. Karl Brunnhölzl is a translator and teacher at Nalanda Bodhi and Nitartha Institute. He has published an astonishing number of translations at Wisdom, from Prajnaparamita literature to the works of many of the great Karmakagyu masters. It's an enormous well to draw from in his teaching and his talk this morning. I've had a sneak preview of his topic, and I haven't stopped thinking about it, how the different use of pronouns in Tibetan and English matter. And then I'm going to introduce Heidi Nevin, who is a translator of Khenpo Ngaga's biography. She has been working in translation for a very long time, and is going to be able to speak from her experience working in the tradition with permission from the lamas in a transmission line that is a crucial part, I think, of the translating process and also of the text itself. So with that, Wulstan.
Good morning, everybody. As the Dean said last night, tradure e tradire. To translate is to betray. There was a time when I believed this was true. And I was sort of brought up to feel that if you wanted to read something in a foreign language, you should do the proper thing and learn the language itself and read it in the original. And so I rather shocked my Tibetan teachers when I told them that I didn't believe in translation. Of course, that is a very naive position to have, since, as George Steiner says, any act of reading is itself an act of translation, since you are reading a text and you are translating it to yourself, interpreting it to yourself. So when I was asked to start translating, it was with a certain amount of resistance. But I couldn't, there was no way not to do it, so I had to start. And as I did so, I was naturally drawn to reflect upon the history of translation in Western culture. And in fact, it had been a rather painful experience. The experience of translation had been rather painful in the sense that I'd grown up as a Christian and I'd had to live through the trauma of the translation of the liturgy, which was, for many people, by no means a pleasant experience. Anyway, I ended up coming to the wonderful preface of the translators to the authorized version, and I was actually going to quote exactly the text that Susan quoted, and which is indeed a very moving definition of translation. But actually, I would just like to add to that the passages, the sentence that comes before and the sentence that follows that text, where the translator says, "Therefore, as one complaineth that always in the Senate of Rome there was one or other that called for an interpreter, so, lest the Church be driven to the like exigent, it is necessary to have translations in readiness." And then later on, after the image of taking away the stone so that we may come by the water, he goes on to say, "Indeed, without translation into the vulgar tongue, the unlearned are but like children at Jacob's well, which was deep, without a bucket or something to draw with. Or as that person mentioned by Issei, to whom, when a sealed book was delivered with this motion, 'Read this, I pray thee,' he was fain to make this answer, 'I cannot, for it is sealed.'" And it seemed to me that, at least in my work as a translator, I was never trained as a translator. I studied modern languages, French and Italian in England. I learned Tibetan self-taught during retreat. And like actually a number of people in Padmakara, we sort of learnt on the job. But I have always understood the translation to be that, to give access to readers who will not be able to read the text in the original. And the texts in question are Buddhist texts which convey messages which, as far as I'm concerned, are profoundly important and extremely helpful to humanity. And therefore, in a way, I see, perhaps wrongly, I'm not sure, that the intention behind the kind of translation I do is to grant access, to give access to the text. It's not to produce a text which I am studying as an object. I feel that the translator, the Buddhist translator, is someone who places himself or herself in the same axis as the original writer. The original writer, whether it's or the writer of the original text, whether it's a sutra or whether it's a shastra, they were all motivated by this ideal of bodhicitta, that is to say, to transmit something that is life-giving, something that is positive. And therefore, the translator is actually a sort of extension of this original author. That doesn't mean to say that the translator necessarily has to be completely invisible, because necessarily the translator is positioned and caught in a given historical and cultural setting. And so many of the things that Susan said resonated very deeply with my own ideas. And in particular, the idea that the translation must be aimed at the reader. The act of translation is only really complete when, as best as one may be able to contrive, the reader, the target reader, understands the message of the original writer. How am I going for time?
Great.
It's finished? It's 10 minutes?
No, you've got a few more minutes.
So yes, I've been particularly, obviously concerned about understanding the original texts, which are often difficult. And Tibetan texts themselves, like I suppose Sanskrit texts before them, they are not necessarily, they don't function in the way that an English book does. An English book is meant to provide you with all the necessary equipment, all the necessary information, indexes, tables of contents, footnotes, etc., to enable the meaning to be apparent, and the book itself is self-sufficient. A Tibetan book is never that. A Tibetan book always depends on commentary, and the written commentary, and also different generations of commentators from different traditions, different points of view, and also the oral interpretation that one needs from a qualified Khenpo or Geshe or Lama and so on. So our work has always been slow, precisely because it has necessarily involved this kind of research and checking and clarification of difficult points and so on. At the same time, I, by temperament, I suppose, I'm very interested in the history of translation and the history of English literature, and the creation of a sort of language that is readily accessible to the reader without talking down to them, without doing anything, without any kind of obscurity. It seems to me that that is the real objective, precisely to transmit the original message. And as that excellent question that was asked in Susan's reply, necessarily one's readership is constantly changing. Translation is never definitive, it must constantly be renewed. And so, now when one is faced with that, I think, and the criticisms that one is always receives, one just has to ignore it and just carry on and do one's best. And in my particular case, I'm very conscious of this, because there's someone called Fletcher. I consider myself an expert in the creation of doggerel. And but every translation is an attempt, and there will be other people who will do better. And finally, I would just like to say one final thing, which is that as a translator, one is making a link with people whose only disqualification is the fact that they don't know the original language. They themselves may be spiritually, intellectually, emotionally far advanced on me. And I am just providing them with a facility which they may in this life do far greater things with than I could ever do. So, yes, translation is a kind of service both to the original writer and also the reader. That's it.
Thank you. So, Anne, please.
Yes, thank you. And good morning, everyone. And what a rich event it's been already. And talking here together about our intention as translators, it seems to me, thinking about this, that even before, right along with thinking about our intentionality as translators, we really have to think about our position as translators, which Wulstan just referred to, the position and posture that we take with respect to the original language and the target language. And so I got to thinking of this as the questions about the yoga of translation. Because, you know, we stretch ourselves, really, to encompass these different worlds. And we might find it a struggle, like we're trying to pull them together, or we might find that we actually have the flexibility to somehow embrace, to some degree, both the worlds and the text that those worlds have produced. And I also got to thinking that as translators, in this yoga, as yoga practitioners do also, we want to get it right. You know, get the position right, get the word right, exactly, as if there was some kind of objective, truly objective measure on these things. But of course, a yoga, any practice, life, always has to be adapted to who we are. And so we can't help but translate out of our own being and out of our own culture. And we aspire to do this, I think, as consciously as possible, as self-consciously as possible, aware of where the mappings don't meet. And many people in this room have reflected on this brilliantly, and I have benefited from what you have taught about this. So with feet in two worlds, as it were, hands grappling at two worlds, mind encompassing, and really more than two, because as we have said, the English language is always changing, even in our lifetime, as you discussed earlier. And Tibetan is also changing and has changed. And when I first started studying, I didn't know any Tibetans who could read English or could read my translations. And I often thought about that. Was that like, phew, they can't read it? Or, you know, really, but also I wanted to know, what would they think, you know? And now, of course, that's a completely different world. And many of you are probably familiar with perhaps a favorite, Jorge Luis Borges, a great translator of cultures and thought, and his famous story, Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote. And he writes there a line that's meant a lot to me as I've been thinking about this conference. He says of Pierre Menard, who was a novelist in the 20th century and wanted to, quote, translate, but really he wanted to write the Quixote. And he felt that to, in some way, become Cervantes and reach the Quixote in that way would be boring, would be too easy, less interesting than to go on being Pierre Menard and reach the Quixote through the experiences of Pierre Menard. And I think that's part of what we struggle with, because we are not Tibetan, especially when we translate texts that are rooted deeply in centuries of Tibetan and Indian-based scholarship, practices that have come down through transmissions and lineage, and you know, we don't have that in our bodies, but we have other stuff. And so where is the line, as we have been talking about, between remaining Pierre Menard, whatever our local identity is, and also stretching it. So I think that is part of the yoga of being a translator. And part of that responsibility, then, is to be aware of both the distances that pertain culturally, linguistically, historically, and so on, and also the possibility of dissolving distances. After all, we do travel. There is path, there is movement, and cultures travel and interact. And this brings me to another lovely, famous image, the image of the two-headed bird, of course. And it struck me only recently that that two-headed bird, interestingly enough, has one body. It's not two birds dancing together, which it could be, but there's one body. So as I think about the intention, my intention, and the responsibility of ourselves that we have as translators, what is that one body? That one body is perhaps partly the coalescence of these various worlds that are in constant interaction. A body is something that is alive, the lifeblood of transmission. Hers are very lively, and then the translator has to be very mentally agile. Again, the yoga, all kinds of postures, bending upside and down, inside and out. And part of another thing that I have in mind thinking about this is Northrop Frye's very interesting use of, in developing a way of reflecting on text. He spoke about some texts as more centrifugal, that is, more leading to what is within than others. His example of that was Ode on a Grecian Urn, and that's centripetal. And centrifugal, going away from the center, going out, and his example of that was Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so I thought, well, what is the center toward which a particular text might be headed, either in oneself as translator, retaining one's identity, and what is the center to which one would hope the text would be addressing in the reader? Perhaps it is some aesthetic experience. Perhaps it is some intellectual clarity. These are very different demands on a translator to try to provide. Perhaps it is inspiration. Perhaps it is the revelation that, hey, this is mysterious and you're never totally going to get it, and we're going to enjoy that fact together. There are many different possibilities. And one of the things that I also thought of about this is that, so we have in a lot of Tibetan literature, Buddhist literature, of course, is translated from or commenting on or in some way guided by the Sanskrit literature. And we also know that the etymology of Sanskrit words isn't necessarily taken up in the Tibetan rendering. So in our being translating centripetally, so to speak, going to the center of, let's say, the text, to what extent do we need or can we take account of, Sanskrit epistemology? So the gacchami, Buddham Sharanam Gacchami, very typically translated as, I go for refuge. Sometimes I take refuge. But really in Sanskrit, when you add certain prefixes like adigam, in many contexts, words of going are words of knowing. And so going to refuge is knowing refuge. And this is kind of really important and perhaps implicit in the Sanskrit. And even though it's not in our etymology, it's implicit in our process of, you would have to identify some Buddha as refuge before you would go. So knowing precedes going. And knowing is always a going in any case, because as we know, and if we look at how Tibetans understand the body, the mind is always riding on prana, lung, and so the mind is always going to what it knows, and the flowing and going and knowing and all of that is part of what ideally would come through in a translation. And it's so hard to do that. It's very lovely to talk about these great ideals, and then when you get down to it, and that does come to the business of, you mentioned, I think that had come up in our conversation in New York, so I think translating is pretty daunting, and it is at best in equal measure daunting and inspiring, because these texts, as you have said, they have to be translated. We have to try to understand them. They're there, and they speak to something that I think all of us in one way or another are passionately interested in. So we really must translate them. And then what? I think that there's also the famous Buddhist advice, Samajilabja, not too tight and not too loose. And this is good advice for yoga. You can't be too stiff or uptight if you're trying to flex yourself into certain positions. And you can't be too rigid either, too tight when you are translating. And yet poring over dictionaries and worrying about the people who are going to read, both as critics and as potential beneficiaries of your translation, is certainly one to, makes one a little nervous. And I do think that, at least looking at myself and the students that I've worked with, I do think that the rush to certainty, I want to know exactly what this word means, what this phrase means, in some ways it's naive, and in some ways it's limiting, and in another way it's crucial. And I love the thing that you said about, that first clumsy, awkward, crazy translation that kind of gets you into it. So as I started the thinking about, Sangyeolgeab Suchi, I tried to think about it freshly, after many years. And well, in a way, you could translate it as like, I go refugiically to the Buddha, Yeah. And you would never say that in public, except among good friends. But, that for me, that's the kind of thing that perhaps one needs to do. Am I done with time?
Another minute, if you need.
Okay, what's 1 minute worth of thing to say? So I think that our readers have minds as well as bodies, and so do we. And in translating, I think there is also the question and the responsibility of the translator in looking at, the reader is as multidimensional as we are. And what are we, through our appreciation of the text, trying to address in the reader? Maybe it's some kind of kinesthetic sense. Some sort of recognition that you have a body. You're not just, an intellect looking at abstract things which are translated into words derived from Latin, which is a great way to get abstract in English. That kind of sensitivity to language, Anglo-Saxon words, mode versus way, coming from Latin versus Anglo-Saxon roots, have just a different valence and maybe a different kinesthetic feel also. Or how would you translate nyambani, Sameness is kind of an abstract, but very, very important and potentially a very beautiful experience. The Oxford Dictionary translates it as something like unchanging, boring, and yet, for us it has a very different valence. Or maybe you would translate it as balance, which has more of an embodied sense. So I just think these are the kinds of things that one might think about.
Thank you. Karl.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. Nice to see all of you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, first about since this panel is about for whom and why. So I think, personally, as a Buddhist translator, for whom, to put it most generally, for all sentient beings. Why? In order to make those sentient beings realize the nature of their mind. So from that point of view, then, I'm going to talk more specifically about how do the features of English grammar, syntax, and thinking influence and, in my opinion, often distort the contents of Buddhist texts that talk about meditation and about realizing mind's nature, such as Dzogchen, Mahamudra, Zen, Dohas, and so on. And second, is there a possibility to convey the non-dual through a language, which is essentially dualistic? So, as Thupten Jinpa said yesterday, in Tibetan, you can have a whole conversation without ever using the first-person pronoun. And I would even say you can have a whole conversation with using any personal pronoun, which is what often throws me off when somebody tells a story and I would constantly keep wondering, well, who said what, who did what? And they are already like 5 things further down the road. So, but it's even worse when you look at the use of Asian languages in Buddhist texts about mind's ultimate nature and its realization. That differs even more from the use of modern language, modern Western idioms. So, like, for example, in Tibetan, you don't have to use first-person pronoun even in ordinary language. In English, especially North American English, it's very hard to conceive any sentence without I, without saying I. Like, I feel, I think, what I hear from you, all these things. So we're used to that very much. And so the modern Western idioms usually require a grammatical subject or an agent, direct or indirect object, personal, demonstrative, possessive pronouns, adjectives, declensions of all these words, verb conjugations, first, second, third person, and so on and so forth, different tenses. Whereas Mahmudra, Dzogchen texts, and so on, and I'm mostly going to use the language of Dzogchen in this talk, they frequently lack some or even all of those elements. And so it's a radically different way, not just of grammar and language, but a radically different way of thinking. So, and this talk is not about grammar primarily, but it's about the underlying thinking that informs what we say. Because what we say and how we say it determines the way we see ourselves and other people, and it also influences what we do. So there's also a very content-relevant use of intransitive versus transitive verbs, and I'm using those two terms here as a rough equivalent of the Tibetan verb distinction chache tadeba or tamideba. In other words, where the agent and the object is the same or not. And so basically what we're talking about here in these texts is that a lot of the passages in them are attempts to convey what is inexpressible and non-dual through language. So, but it's a very particular language. It's basically a language without a speaker, strictly speaking, no pun intended. So how do we convey being rather than doing, which is what these texts are trying to do, recognizing rather than attaining, revealing rather than creating, and seeing through rather than relinquishing. So in addition, then, such being rather than doing is a being without a beer, recognizing occurs without a recognizer, revealing happens without a revealer, non-doing does not involve a non-doer, occurring is without an occurrer, and even if some action happens, it is usually without an agent. So from that perspective then, a lot of what we are used to reading and also translating, and I'm not exempting myself from that up to this point, are complete oxymorons from that perspective, such as, may I realize the nature of my mind. Right? You have I and my. I recognize my own nature. I rest in awareness. We meditate on Rigpa. I relax in mind's nature. You settle in the nature of your thoughts. She looks at her Rigpa. You recognize your essence, or we become Buddhas. So from the perspective that I just mentioned, all of these are complete oxymorons. Why? Because it is not me or a person or a sentient being or any dualistic consciousness that can recognize or meet Rigpa. Because a self, persons, sentient beings, and all 8 consciousnesses are by nature deluded and dualistic. So Rigpa can only recognize itself for what it is, instead of being obscured by all that what we are used to and all that what we usually say and think. So it's a very radical approach. You could say it's basically it's a nice, interesting experiment if you take those phrases that I just mentioned or others, and you just take out any pronoun, you take out any my, things like that, you take out the subject too. So what does that leave of your language? You might just end up maybe with a verb. And a lot of time it's a verb that's not an active verb. So then basically, rather than saying these sentences that I just mentioned, you could maybe rather say recognition happens. Or there is recognition, as opposed to I recognize Rigpa, or something like that. So it sounds like a small difference, maybe, but I think if you compare these two and look what happens in your mind, rather than just the grammar, I think there's a profound impact that can ideally jolt you out of the usual habitual tendencies in which we bring in our ordinary language patterns, even into texts whose whole purpose is to transcend all of that, thinking and language. So that's why I think using our usual language patterns in texts of that caliber is not only influencing them, but also distorting the basic message, which is one of non-self, non-duality, and non-doing. So that's why I talk here about the art of the syntax of non-self, non-duality, and non-doing as the three main characteristics of that kind of approach. And so even when you look at imperatives like rest your Rigpa or rest in mind's nature, settle within Rigpa, all of those, basically in English also they still imply a you, right? If not explicit, at least implicitly. So which means it sounds like there is something that's different from Rigpa that is then supposed to settle into Rigpa, like plopping into it somehow. So when we use our regular language patterns, then from a Dzogchen point of view, what we do is we talk about Rigpa from the perspective of Sem, like dualistic mind, instead of letting Rigpa talk from his own perspective. And so by doing that, then we go basically constantly against the most crucial Dzogchen distinction, which is between Sem and Rigpa. So as long as we talk about Rigpa from the perspective of Sem, we won't get anywhere as far as Rigpa is concerned. So the suggestion here is to try to find a language or experiment with a language that is more conducive to actually letting Rigpa itself talk as much as it talks to us through a language. So, and of course, that's not completely possible because it's still language, and Rigpa really doesn't have anything to say, at least not to us. So you could say the basic koan here, in a sense, is what is my mind without me? So if you think about that and then try to come from that point of view to use a language that is as much as possible pronoun-free, declension-free, subject-free, agent-free, along the lines of recognition happens, resting happens, rather than saying somebody rests or somebody is doing something, then I think it can go a long way to actually not just do a translation, but really have an element of transmission in there. Like giving people a sense of, wow, there is really something different going on here than from how I usually speak and think. How is time?
It's good.
It's good.
Heidi, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I must apologize for being such a sorry replacement for the glorious Sangye Khandro. I hope she's okay. It's a great privilege to be in this amazing, illustrious group. And I'm totally undeserving of this seat. But I guess I can only speak to the power of aspiration and the power of blessing, because it seems that my life has taken shape as a direct result of those two things. I don't know what kind of aspirations I made in previous lifetimes, but they were good ones. And meeting my Lama, Tsadra Rinpoche, led to translating his guru's autobiography, Kampong Ngakchong, Kampong Ang Palsang, of Katok. And I just read the Namtar in my retreat, which followed several years of studying Tibetan language at Manjushri in Darjeeling in order to become a Tibetan doctor, not a translator.
but I was told that because I was a girl, I was going to be a distraction for the boys who were studying medicine, and so I should become a nun. And so I decided to study with Tsadra Rinpoche instead, who turned out to be the true doctor with the true medicine. Anyway, during my Guru Yoga period of my second Ngondro over there, I studied in each of my afternoon sessions, Kambong Ngakchung's Namtar, with the dictionary, with the Tsigzo Chenmo, because I wasn't allowing myself to use any English. So I was reading, only the Tibetan and then the Tibetan to Tibetan, and writing down all the words I didn't know. So I was sort of training myself, but only because I wanted to understand this book. And it moved me so immensely. I was so awed by it that I got this idea, I could translate this into English. So when I finished it, and when I finished retreat, I went to see Rinpoche. I told them I either cry or throw up. When I talk about this, I threw up after talking about this book in front of Lama Tarchen a few years ago. I didn't throw up in front of him, thankfully. So I took the text early one morning and asked permission to translate it. And, that was out of the blue for me. I hadn't ever asked to translate anything. And, crap. And it was this very moving moment with him alone for half an hour or so when he gave me advice on not rushing. Don't rush. Take your time. There's no rush. Don't mess up. Because if you mess up, we are all of our samayas are going to be corrupted. So I was like,
No pressure.
I could corrupt the samayas of Tsadra Rinpoche. So, it felt very weighty, but also he was so happy. He was very surprised, very joyful, and, empowered me. So from that moment, it was like this amazing, magical unfolding of all of my, I would think, okay, I really would love for Tukul Dundrup to be my, editor and counsel me on this text. And at the 2008 translation conference here, there was Tukul Dundrup. I asked him, he said yes, and he spent years exchanging pieces of my manuscript over, he was at the time 70 years old. Of course, he's this very brilliant scholar in Tukul with an amazing grasp of email and track changes. I said, should I, print and send? He said, no, I'll just use track changes. So he was phenomenal. And then I also had prayed, after reading Dujum Rinpoche's history of the Nyingma for so many years, that Gyurme Dorje could somehow be my final editor. And boom, he said, I'd love to do that. And Lama Tarchen kindly forced Eric to publish it because it's a restricted text. So Nico wasn't going to be stuck with a bunch of copies that he couldn't sell to anyone. So Eric took care of it, and it was all, the process of the book, it took me 10 years with 2 children being born and in between all that, and many trips back and forth to Tibet with my crazy Tibetan American marriage. And, you know, by the end, it was, there was never a day when I was burned out on that text. It was such a joy. And Annie Jimba connected me to Jakob Leschly halfway through, and he and I collaborated through the whole final process. That was completely harmonious and so fun. You know, we laughed so much, and I tell you, laughter is a great, important part of translating because it can be so isolating and so frustrating. And Kambung Ngakchung's namtar is not an ordinary namtar. It's phenomenally filled. I mean, everything, every kind of pure vision, but also every kind of text, and you know, it's rich beyond measure. So I needed tons of help from Jules Levinson, wherever you are, on the Madhyamaka. And, you know, I just learned as I went. But I have to tell you this little thing in my completion that I haven't, it's not really appropriate to put in the introduction of the book, but in the year, let's see, I was pregnant with Tashi, 2009, 10, the New Year's of 2010 in Hong Kong. I dreamed of Kambung Ngakchung. Sorry, I'm an emotional wreck. And, you know, they're serious Derge dialect, and I was sitting at his feet. I said, so, are you, in Tibetan, are you translating my namtar? I said, yes, Rinpoche. With your blessing, I'm translating your namtar. And he said, do you have funding? Yes, thanks to your blessing, I have funding. Oh, he was happy. And then he gave me an acupuncture treatment in the top of my head, needle, and, you know, serious electric shocks in the dream. But I felt like I had been, at that moment, totally authorized. And my main objective, I took out poor Gyurma Dorji's archaic language, and all his Sanskrit diacritics, and I wanted more than anything for this text to not impede the flow of this powerful flow of blessings that comes from this incredible lineage. So I wanted it to read very smoothly and not be too beleaguered by weird terminology. And I wanted it to reach, and you said it perfectly, that you hoped that it would reach people who were greater than you, who could use it to reach great, and that was my, you know, and sorry, do I have another?
Yes, please.
I just want to share what Tukutundra shared with me in 2008 about intention. He said, don't limit your audience ever. Don't just think of a particular readership. Think of all, keep it as vast as you possibly can. Keep it all sentient beings. And he said also, every 20 minutes, pause in your work. Of course, I never remember to look at the clock, and renew that bodhicitta intention to refresh yourself as you work. So I thought those were really very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. So the way our format is going, so now Wulstan has another 5-10 minutes to reflect.
Well, there's one thing that I wanted to say particularly, which was following on from something that Susan had said about there's first steps of where you're confronted with the text and you have to sort of demolish it in a way, to sort of, go through and find out the meaning. And in this, my work has been, I have an indispensable collaboration with my companion, Helena Blankeneder, who knows Tibetan far better than I do. And she has the advantage of not being English. She's Czech. And her English is good. But the thing is that when she's writing, she focuses entirely on the meaning. She tries to capture the meaning. And then I come along, and then we work together with the Tibetan, and we put it into digestible English. That's the intention anyway. And that's a very, very lucky chance, really. And then she's very, very strict, and she demands, if there's anything she doesn't understand, out it goes. And she actually, she's, as I agree with her, I mean, the main thing is that the meaning should be expressed. If the meaning doesn't get through, the translation is defective. Especially in this kind of literature. I mean, other kinds of literature, it's not the same. I mean, if you're translating a novel, you have quite different expectations, different sort of demands. But in this kind of thing, you really need to, well, first of all, you have to understand the text, which is by no means a given. And then, because if you don't understand it, then you can't translate it. And that's where all the research comes in. But I have always found it very helpful to have that first step in which she's down in the mine, tapping at the coalface, and I'm on the surface, sort of working through everything and putting it into a decent form. And obviously, this brings into play the tension between what I think in translation studies they call adequacy and acceptability. And the translation is adequate if it succeeds in capturing the sense of the original, and it becomes acceptable to the extent that the reader is able to read the translation in a sense as if it were the original and understand the original, as much as one can. There's no such thing as equivalence, obviously. There's no such thing as a perfect or definitive translation. Everything that we do are just attempts. And I suppose over time, the experience of translators will accumulate and result in something more and more useful. So there again, there is this tension between literacy, literal translation, and meaning translation. I believe in Tibetan they talk about a word translation and a meaning translation. And some people say that one of the qualities of the Tibetan translations from Sanskrit is that they were extremely close. To which it must be added that Tibetan and Sanskrit belong to two completely different linguistic families with an entirely different grammar and syntax. Again, it can be said that when the translations took place in Tibet, they had sufficient cultural freedom to create a language that was specially adapted to this to the reception of these kinds of ideas. When you compare a Tibetan text with its Sanskrit original, obviously they look very different. And likewise, when you move from Tibetan into English, they look very different. Tibetan syntax. When I teach Tibetan grammar, I usually tell my students that Tibetan grammar is not particularly complicated. What is difficult is Tibetan syntax. That's what throws people off. So you have to develop, with experience, you have to kind of develop the skill to break down the long Tibetan periods into acceptable sentences. Tibetans don't write in sentences in our sense of the word. Having said that, what license, what latitude is one allowed to take when you translate a text? Obviously, you want to produce something that reads easily. And if it reads too easily, people say, oh, this can't be right, this can't be, it must be more complicated than this. We want a literal translation. And over time, I have, in a way, come round to that idea. You know, I read up quite a lot before this conference. I read up quite a lot about the translation in antiquity in the West and what the Romans were doing when they were translating Greek, and what the Church Fathers were doing when they were translating also. And it has been brought home to me by an excellent book by Rita Copeland that, in fact, they're actually quite different agendas. And the thing is that if you are translating a text, the meaning of which is absolutely paramount, you have to create at least the confidence in the reader that what they're reading really does correspond to what the original writer says. So, for instance, in the translation of by St. Jerome of the Vulgate, or of other translators translating Greek, the works of Greek theologians into Latin, you have somebody like Augustine, who, to begin with, is all for a kind of free translation that conveys the sense, especially when he's trying to defend the Septuagint against Jerome's attacks, saying that it's not accurate, that it doesn't actually say what the Hebrew says in many places. And he defends it by saying, yes, but the translation is inspired, as well as the original. Later, or I think it's later, in the De Doctrina Christiana, he says that the trouble is that when you're reading these texts, you're never quite sure whether this smooth translation of the original is really right. So I have to go to somebody who only translates word for word. That way I have a better idea of what the original said. To which a translation theorist might well say, well, it may be more literally what the original said, but do you actually understand what the original said in the way that it said it? And then you have this the whole kind of tension between, you know, the Ciceronian and Horatian idea that they don't want to write as a sort of fidus interpres, as the faithful interpreter, but as somebody who is actually replacing the original writer. And then you have somebody like Boethius, who in his translation of this second commentary to the Isagoge, he says, in this text, I'm going to stick very, very close to the Greek. And of course, I'm likely to suffer the attacks of those people who criticize faithful translators, literal translators. But he says, nevertheless, it's important because this is a technical text. And the reader has to understand all the technicalities. And of course, a lot of the texts that we translate are very technical, you know, Buddhist. So you do need to write English, but it has to be pretty close as you can make it. There's always this tension, you know. Often one doesn't succeed, but you know that's the name of the game.
Thank you.
I really appreciated the further thing I was thinking about was in addition to the responsibility that the translator has to the text and the tradition and the reader, there's a certain kind of responsibility for attention to, you know, your own process. And I really appreciated, of course, what you said about Tulku Thondop's advice to pause every 20 minutes and fill with bodhicitta, to give yourself space, and as an antidote to the tightness that can happen in translating. And also the sensitivity to language, Karl, that you were speaking of in this very important and interesting reflection on how to take the doing out of being, or something like that. And I think this is really And this seems really, really important. And for me, it is also a variant along the trajectory of tightness and looseness, which I think is really an infinitely interesting kind of trajectory to explore. And that, Wulstan, as you were saying, some texts definitely require more what I might call tightness. I mean, you can't, if there are technical terms, there has to be some way, perhaps as a phrase and not a single term. Perhaps you give context as part of the responsibility of the reader, I think, as translators, as came out beautifully in Don and Jimba's talk last night. There's a lot of responsibility to help carry the transmission, which you can help the reader see and experience by doing all kinds of things. The skillful introduction, the story you told is a fantastic way of really bringing alive, something of the preciousness of the text that you translated. Images, I think, are really important in text. Jimba spoke about the impact of the printed page. So true. As translators, we don't always have that much to say about, our book covers and our printed pages and so on, but I think it's really, really important. Or digital material, backup. So that kind of responsibility is also there. But more back to the business about process and tightness and looseness. So I've been studying a little bit, following Claire Petit-Mangin and some other work of people who are looking into how intuition opens. And I think that when words dawn, as translators, we're always, always looking about, what's a good word? What's your word for this? And then we get tired of words, or they become passé, and so on. And when do words come to you? I think that's important to notice. I've noticed that they come to me when I'm talking excitedly about the topic, but not like trying to find a word, and just a word comes out. And then, ooh, that word came out, and if I remember it. The thing about intuition that has been, I think, significantly explored, not surprisingly, is that it comes when you have a certain kind of, we could say, relaxation, a certain kind of interior space, which bodhicitta certainly is a tremendous example of. And that even the language, speaking to Karl's point, the language that people use in studies eliciting, evoking people's experience, or actually studying the writing of great scientists, Newton and Einstein, and what happened just before this great idea dawned. And they use words like, it dawned, or it came to me. There's a kind of dissolving or softening of a duality, and there's a softening of the kind of agency that you are also seeking to pull out of the text in a way, and that allowing of something to come seems very, very important. And time? No time?
That's good. We'll have plenty of time to keep you here talking. So.
And as I was thinking about that, I was remembering maybe 30 years ago or so, Don told me this quote, which we think now is Ring Lardner, and he said something like, writing is easy. You just sit down at your typewriter, this was a long time ago, you sit down at your typewriter and wait until drops of blood appear from your forehead. And we both laughed and said, yeah, I know what that means. But then there's also this other side, the tightness-looseness thing of just allowing something to come, the intuition, the inspiration, the dream. Is also and for everyone that dynamic might be different, but it seems part of our responsibility is to, not get so tight that we foreclose our curiosity and our creativity, which, has certainly happened to me. I think it does, get enclosed in a body of literature or something like that, and then you kind of have to take some conscious moves to recognize the possibility of moving out of that. Refuge opens, I thought, as when I was thinking about what you said. So, may it be so.
Thank you.
So, I'd like to get a little bit more specific again. Giving one example of the use of an intransitive verb as opposed to a transitive verb in Dzogchen, which one of the most prominent is the intransitive verb trolwa. which a lot of people still translate as to liberate, but that's actually the transitive form, drolva. So people who don't speak Tibetans, excuse me, but it sounds the same. I know it's not. So drolva, the intransitive form, means to dissolve, to come or become undone, to become unraveled, and most importantly in Dzogchen, to be free, not even to become free. The transitive word drolva means to untie, to unravel, to liberate, and to free. So that means the second, the transitive one, has a direct object by necessity, and it also involves action, like to free somebody, to liberate somebody, as opposed to be free, which doesn't involve an agent and also not doing anything. So even if we say to become free is inappropriate from the perspective of Rigpa. I'm trying again to be like spokesman of Rigpa here, which is of course not possible, but and I haven't been authorized either, but Rigpa didn't appear in one of my dreams. But Rigpa cannot and need not become free or be made free. So therefore, it's naturally free already. That's the whole point. So the transitive English verb to liberate then is absolutely not suitable here because Rigpa is not liberated by anybody or anything, not even by itself. So, but still, what we find mostly in translations of that term, and also the many compound terms in Dzogchen, such as self-liberation, primordial liberation, naked liberation, all those things, a lot of people use liberation or liberated. So, but if you speak about liberation, then that implies prior bondage. Whereas the whole point of this intransitive verb, trolva, is the utter lack of any bondage to begin with, past, future, or present. And even conventionally, if you say primordial liberation, it's an oxymoron, because if liberation existed primordially, then from what would one be liberated? That doesn't work out. So, and if there's nothing to be liberated from, then how can one even speak of liberation? On the other hand, being free in itself, or being primordially free, that works in English much better and also is more closer to what is actually supposed to be conveyed here. So we could say being nakedly free, being primordially free, and so on and so forth. So if you think I'm all making this just up, then let me quote the Dzogchen Tantra, the Dra Taljura Tantra, and I won't translate the title because that's another talk. So it says here, as for this mind that is not to be freed, and it uses the transitive form of the verb, it says it's not to be freed through anything, but rather it's naturally free. It says since it is primordially free, there's no ground to be delivered to. Since it is free by itself, there is no remedy. Since it is nakedly free, all vanishes in the place of its being seen. Since it is completely free, there is no effort. And Longchenpa's Precious Treasury of the Supreme Jnana also says, since being free, and he uses the intransitive form, trolva, is not like freeing or liberating, and he uses the transitive form, so he explicitly says these are not the same, there is no need for any effort through view or meditation. Being free means being present in its own natural condition, while lacking any contrivance. So the essential point of being primordially free is that it refers to already having been free from the very beginning, and not suddenly at some point. Therefore, there is nothing to become free again right now. So that means freedom as it is understood here by this verb trolva, or verbal noun, is the primary mode of being of the mind in the Dzogchen tradition, not some distant goal to be achieved like through going through a path. So in that sense, it's also not freedom of something, because it's primordially free, and it's also not freedom to do something. It's a natural condition, freedom since the beginning. So it's a more state of being rather than doing again. And so in that way, it's quite different from the usual classical Buddhist notion of a attained freedom or liberation at the end of a path, like all the paths and bhumis you go through. And then at the end of that, there is something new, which is called liberation from the obscurations through the methods of the path. So from Dzogchen point of view, then beings do not have freedom or attain freedom, but they are fundamentally free in their nature of Rigpa. Still have a few minutes? Or not?
You can have my time.
I don't know, I lost track of time. Oh, that's fine. Okay.
I don't have anything to say.
Do you want to add anything?
Well, I just wanted to add this, or emphasize this point of not doing. Like these Dzogchen texts, as well as Zen texts and others, they use language in a deconstructive manner, mostly, rather than a constructive. Like rather than telling you, do this, they usually tell us, don't do basically anything. And there's also many quotations I could add here. But the point is not about doing anything. It's not even about learning some new tricks. But it's basically about stop doing whatever you're doing. No matter what it is. And that's why at this point I use the new English verb don'ting.
Does that qualify as English, Wulstan?
So with this Buddhist hybrid English word, then I conclude.
Is that transitive? Or?
That is actually a great segue to some of the questions that have been coming in. And it sort of harkens back, I'm going to sort of frame some of them. It harkens to the Dean's comment of the translator as agent of change, and Susan's sort of presentation of the translator as really doing something and should be recognized as doing something and being active. And I think, I wonder how much you as translators are intentionally and also aware of changing English. At what point do you think you need to invent new English words? And at what point, and sort of the registers, one comment asked, some of these Tibetan texts are very cryptic. Some of these Tibetan texts are very difficult. Do you want to put them into easy, smooth, readable English, or should the English be a comparatively difficult to read, sort of bang your head against the wall, in need of a teacher's explanation? And so how do you make that decision in the sort of the tone and the words you use to reflect the tone of the original? When do you alter and become an agent of change and alter English? And the way Karl is talking about, this would be a whole new English in a way. Do you want to? Yeah.
I have a rather different approach from Karl's. But in answer to that question, I think that as translators, we have a responsibility to our own language, and we should respect it. And I think that translation, like any form of writing, is essentially a form of communication. And so I would be very loath to create neologisms. I would, as a procedure, I would rather search through English literature and English language and find words that we may not know of, or that may already exist. And I don't think that we as translators are really in a position to decide to change the language. I think the language does change, and it does change thanks to translations, but it's not the translators that do it. It's the general readership, the people who decide what works, and that's how language change occurs. the way that words have changed meaning, even in my life. You know, when I was young, sophistication was considered a rather bad thing, and you know, it had connotations of artificiality and pretension. But nowadays, it's if you're sophisticated, it's cool. You're an educated person. Things like that. But that's not a decision that anybody's taken. It's these sort of things happen, and I think actually, but this is my own temperament, I suppose. I am rather loath to. I tend to resist the changes that come in through mere colloquialism or slang or whatever. For no other reason that they are usually so ephemeral, they don't last. So, and what's that? Is that an answer to the question? Going to Karl's thing about non-dual language, I would only say that I do not believe that Tibetan is any less dualistic than English, and I don't think Sanskrit is either. I think it's a happy chance that Tibetan has this ability to dispense with pronouns. It's also a happy chance that Sanskrit does, for quite different reasons. Sanskrit is more like Latin, you know, you don't have to use pronouns, the verb says it all. On the question of language, I think it seems to me that all language is on the level of the relative truth, the relative convention. Non-dual language is silence, actually. It's not, you can't, you know, you can't talk about what is unsayable. But on the level of the relative truth, ordinary language can be used to point you in certain directions, with the hope that you might get it. And of course, one of the ways of doing this is through poetry. The feeling, the effect of the poem can actually convey a meaning that is not just in the words. It depends on the words, of course, but it's not there. And you know, if a person is sufficiently receptive, that person will understand what's being said. And I think the whole thing about, you know, the verbal introductions from a qualified teacher and so on, and the sort of things he might do to you, like hitting you on the head with a book, are ways of actually communicating a meaning that cannot be verbalized. I think we have to write English. We can't come up with some sort of weird idiom that people don't understand. I mean, you have to use pronouns in English. You can't get out of it. If you don't use pronouns, people won't know what you mean. At the same time, you can do it sensitively, and you can explain, or you can translate in a way that a teacher can use your translation in order to make that point. You know, Nagarjuna is pointing towards, he uses language and he uses logic in order to push the mind actually beyond language and beyond logic, but that part doesn't get said, as Chandrakirti says, that is a state of silence. So, I don't know, I'm rather suspicious about this idea of daunting.
I'm not surprised. I knew it would be. But to be sure, I didn't say that Tibetan or Sanskrit is inherently less dualistic than English, and I don't think that's true. But I think it's the way how you use a language in order to point at something that's beyond language. There's more skillful ways and less skillful ways to do that. That was my
Yes,
point.
but the Tibetans are lucky in that sense. They're more lucky than we are.
True, but still, I mean, you know, why not give it a shot in English as well? And maybe it's only because I'm not a native English speaker, so I don't know it enough that I can really make a valid point here. But
Have you tried it in German?
yes,
And what was the reaction among Germans?
silence.
Well, there you are.
Heidi, you had something to say?
Oh, I have a question for Wulstan, Stan, about the word gongpa. And that's where I'm guilty of using these created improper translations, like wisdom mind, wisdom realization, wisdom intention, which are not, it's not proper English, but it's become...
Well, it's not bad. I often say that.
All right, enough said. Well, wisdom is a noun. It's not an adjective, so it's sort of...
Yes, but in English, nouns can fulfill the function of adjectives.
Oh, then,
You are authorized again.
I can't take credit for those, of course. I think Don't Say Trinley Nordbo came up with those, and I just continue to use them. But.
Sometimes I think it's quite important, especially, we are in the early stages of translating Buddhist texts, so I think very often it's quite useful to put in brackets the Tibetan term.
Yes, I do that.
First time, so that people,
Yes.
people know what you're talking about.
Right.
But the Tibetans had this mania for translating everything in Sanskrit. All the Sanskrit names of all the Sanskrit teachers get translated into Tibetan. All the tantras get translated, but very often, which is fine if you're a Tibetan, but if you're trying to work out what on earth they're talking about or who they're referring to, it's quite difficult.
Yeah.
And we've had this pressure on us in Dordogne to translate names. And it was only after we had a survey of readers who said, we had all the names translated, and they said, we can't stand it. Don't translate the names. And it was only then that the person who wanted it said, okay. And as in our tradition, we don't translate names. We don't call you powerful King Lotus. We don't call you that. And he had to accept that was the case.
I was actually thinking that English has an advantage in terms of what Karl was talking about in being a pronounically oriented language, because then it's more noticeable and actually quite poetic when you say something like, Rikpa dawns or opens or happens or something like that. Whereas the poor Tibetans, they won't notice that this is different, right? Because they're not using pronouns anyway. And, so the very fact that it's in contrast to ordinary speech, I think actually could be used to advantage in this case. And the other thing I was thinking, and what was I going to say about that? That seems important, actually, so that we can play off the, quote, limitations of our language by kind of an oasis that's a little different, but still flows, in a way where it feels. Robert Bresson, I read recently, said in his films, he said that objects should look like they want to be there. And I was thinking about this in terms of translation, that the words should seem like they hang there, and that seems important. And then I was also thinking in this conversation about matrix. The question was, are we aware of changes in language? And Ying, Chiying is one of the, I just think about that all the time. And if you look at THL, they're 20 or 30, varyingly philosophically minded or simple definitions of it or possible alternatives. So one time I thought I'd really hit on great translation because etymologically it worked. And then I realized this was really a case of being way too tight. I called it matrix or spacious matrix. But of course, everybody thought about the movie. It's impossible. And no matter how, but that's kind of an important lesson, I feel, for me, that sometimes you can be really right, you can go back to etymological roots and you're right, but it just doesn't work. And that's important to recognize. Jigme Lingma says the essence of speech, Ngok, he's talking about, the essence of speech is win, is lung. And so he's really, when I read that, I think, he's not worried about what word you'll use so much as what's going to flow through your body. You know, what kind of shift might occur. And that also seems important. And that definitely changes from even place to place. And,
Thanks.
yeah.
I think it is possible for a good writer, a great writer, to play with language, and you know, Shakespeare does it all the time. You know, like he can say "but me no buts,"
Yes.
meaning don't say "but," and he uses "but" as a verb. Or you can take something like Gerard Manley Hopkins, who's somebody says something like, "Each thing does one thing and the same, selves, goes itself, myself it speaks and spells, saying what I do is me, for that I came." So it's selves, he makes it into a verb, and it's very, very powerful. But it's not something I could sort of go out to the shop and say, you know, and say selves. They won't know what I'm talking about. You know, you can actually create an environment in which you can use a word, but if you're a translator, the constraints are pretty strong. You know, you can't just do anything, except perhaps rarely to effect.
Sure. Well, I think if you compare to, you know, what people in the shop say, then you should never translate anything, especially in a Buddhist context, because it's always a special environment. Like, especially if you're translating meditation texts or Dzogchen texts, even within Buddhism, they are very special environments that don't make much sense to anybody else. So if it's clear you already are in a different environment,
Well,
then I think it also requires a different language.
well, it's true, but on the other hand,
more
you know,
freedom
the
to-
the Tibetan writers that often write this kind of stuff can be pretty rough campers, and they speak the language that they, you know, like as Luther would say, you go into the marketplace and you speak to the women and the children there, and you speak their language, and then they'll realize that you're speaking to them in German. You know, that it's not some sort of strange message. I mean, you might. This is sort of domestication in a big way, I suppose. But the immense success of Luther's Bible translation was because he's actually used the language of the people.
That is true, but I think Bible translation is quite different from a Dzogchen text. In
Yes.
my opinion.
Well, yes,
Compare those.
it is, but not necessarily the language in which you express it.
Can I jump in?
Would disagree, but
Can I jump in? So when you choose text so you're choosing a difficult text that you know the meaning is obscure in Tibetan or Sanskrit. I want to bring back this question: do you want to make the meaning obscure in English? And do you, at that point, also feel a responsibility to explain it? Do you leave it for the teacher to explain it? Do you leave the reader on her own? Or do you also translate a commentary along with it to help? And so it's sort of do you present the cryptic of the original as well as help understanding it? I mean, what's your job in that? Anne, you want to jump first?
Okay. I think it really depends on the text. Very much depends on the text. I mean, I think that our responsibility as translators is partly shaped by what we're translating and what register we are communicating. If we even use, lower categories, is it speaking more to the conceptual apparatus? Like Trumtau or debate texts, philosophical texts? You really want to get the categories straight. Is it appealing more to a kind of non-conceptual part of the person? You want the inspired versus on bodhicitta. So I think the answer is very different depending on that. And that said, I feel that for example, Dzogchen has often, Longchenpa, Jimilingpa, when they're writing poetry, which is often, there's an incredible flow. And I think to start that flow with difficult words or an overwhelming percentage of Latin-derived words maybe doesn't have the feel. If we're talking about functional symmetry, that you want the text to function for the person in the way that it functions in its home culture as much as possible. So if it's a hard debate text, and you want it to furrow the brow and people to think hard and so forth. If it's another kind of text, Dzogchen texts, they're hard to really understand, but they're actually very easy to read in Tibetan. Very easy. So I personally feel that mirroring that as much as possible is a nice goal.
I would agree with that. It depends a lot on what kind of text it is, but I think basically it's part of our job as translators to give as much context, no matter what the text is like, and help people as much as possible to understand what it says, be it through introduction, footnote, or whatever it is. But I also think that sometimes if it sounds too smooth, then people just read it and then, okay, let's move on to the next thing, and there is no time for anything to sink in. There is also no time, that you have to maybe question your own habitual patterns there, or what you think. Oh yeah, that must be it, no question. So sometimes I think it's good to maybe use a word that is not as easily digestible. It's more like a speed bump, like jolts you, and you think, oh wow, I went too quick here. So I better slow down and look at this again, or
But
contemplate it.
In that, would you be following the original, or would you decide as the translator to introduce that?
No, I would, of course, try to follow the original. I mean, I'm not trying to make up some weird jargon, though other people probably will perceive it as that. And I'm also, not to be clear, I'm not using the actual word "don'ting," so don't worry. But I think sometimes, especially with poetry, I mean, there's some license there. And it's a question whether you want to convey like a felt experience or an atmospheric, inner atmospheric setting, as opposed to, just get the words right. Whether it's considered proper English or not, frankly, and probably because I'm German, whether this is then 100% Oxford English or not, I don't care. If it has the effect of, actually evoking something in the person that, from my point of view, is in line with how I understand it.
Heidi?
I think probably this hinges on whether the Buddhist community is educated in the process of studying text. If people are taught that they need to seek oral instruction, not just read a text and presume to understand it, then we can confidently leave things unexplained and cryptic. But I'm not sure that's... We're very confident of our intellects in this part of the world, and don't necessarily seek out instruction.
That's another question I want to raise, is the distribution of the texts in Tibet, at least in traditional Tibet, would sort of belong to the community, and the text would always not stray too far from the teacher, whereas now with modern publishing they seem to float freely. So you can pick up a text and be utterly disconnected from the tradition. So how, as translators, again, how do you choose these texts, and are you aware of those issues of this is a text that traditionally in the line of transmission would be associated with a teacher and a community, and now it's available on a bookstore? What sort of role do you see yourself in that, and how do you deal with that?
I think you have to come clean and say, and just tell the reader exactly what the situation is. You can say this is a text that is for people who have received initiation, and so on and so forth. It presupposes a great deal of knowledge already, and so the thing is that, do you restrict the sales, or do you restrict the distribution? And that's a difficult question. My only feeling against restricted sales is that I don't think it works very well. I think it's better to to appeal to the good, the good intention, the honesty, the integrity of the reader, and say, if you haven't received this initiation, then please receive it before you read this text, or study this with a qualified teacher, and otherwise, you may get into trouble. People have to treat people as adults. They have to, Apart from that, what else can you do? The rest is their responsibility. But to go back to what you were saying, Karl, I agree with you. I think that in the West, a book is meant to be as self-explanatory as possible. And I think I have certainly benefited a great deal from your footnotes. I'm very glad that they were there. And, I think it's whatever help one can give to the reader, I think. One may not be right, but, one tries to help as much as possible.
I think the whole issue of restriction is pretty much taken out of our hands, because everything is available everywhere, or people make it available if it is not. Like you can find pretty much any book on the web now, full length, any website, So, as Wulstan said, you can clearly state what the restriction is or how it is treated traditionally, or ideally, from a point of view, and then it's up to the person to respect it or not. I mean, you can't control everybody. That's impossible.
Having said that, of course, there are some things that one does hesitate to translate. And, there are things that could easily be misunderstood, and to the danger of the reader. So, but I think that if you've been asked to translate something by your teacher, then you do it as best as you can, and you don't miss anything out. I don't think it's the role of the translator to act as a censor.
There's that amazing line in the movie Maurice when they're reading the Greek poems, and the Don says before somebody gets to something sexual, omit the reference to the particular weakness of the Greeks or something like that. And you were gonna.
Well, I was just reflecting how important oral commentary is in the Tibetan tradition, and how important it has been to me, and I kind of, with surprise, almost noted as I reflected on what I've done. Actually, there's been a lot of oral commentary in those texts, and it wasn't like a strategy as a translator. I decided it was really that's what I loved about reading text, was that I could read it with a teacher who would give me commentary, and there would be a relationship around it. The text, honestly, was just too hard. I would never want to have been left alone with it. I probably wouldn't have read it, and it really would not have drawn me into, a passionate interest in Buddhist thought and so on. But the relationship around the text, and that's very much how they worked, of course, traditionally, and I think it's still very important. So whenever possible, and for as long as we are fortunate to still have highly learned Tibetan masters, Khenpos, Rinpoches, and so on, scholar who can offer oral tradition, I think that's supremely significant.
I'm going to jump in with another question from the audience. It segues nicely, Anne, to your point. What about, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, what about the role of the translator as the teacher? Do you fashion yourself? I mean, Anne, you are a teacher and you have students, but how do you negotiate that? I'm a translator, I'm a teacher, or I'm just a translator here, I'm just
I don't know that it's any harder than negotiating, being a mother and being a scholar, or, people have different roles in life. I mean, maybe there are different projections that people feel would happen to those two things, but I feel, I remember once sitting down with at a retreat with Namkhe Norpa Rinpoche, and of course he was famous or infamous among some circles for teaching Bön, and so somebody, I think, out of that conversation sat down next to him and said, Norbu, are you a Buddhist? He's so great. He just looked up and he said, I'm Norbu. Which gets back to the Pierre Menard. Some people write in paint. So maybe I don't understand in a way what the question is really getting at, but when I translate, exactly as Jimba said, when I translate, the people are there, oral translation, are here to hear the teacher, and you do your best, and it's very terrifying, and you do your best and pray, and that's that. And then when you're teaching, of course, you try to be as clear and helpful as you can be. So,
Right.
go with me.
I think Susan said it that somebody said it that the translator has to lose their ego in the translation process, which I definitely feel is the case, both in written and oral. And I think in relationship to also being a teacher, I think that is an excellent, you could say, counterbalance, because in the role of a teacher, of course, one is also supposed to lose one's ego or keep it in check at least. But being a translator, I think, helps for that a lot because you systematically train in that. So ideally, that carries over into being in a teaching role, which should make the thing more clean, hopefully. And then on the other hand, also I think being a teacher then helps you being a translator by providing more context, because you have some knowledge that you have received and you can transmit that in addition to what the text itself says. So I think the two are actually, they go together quite well.
Do you want to comment on that?
It's it has been occurring to me that it is kind of like the yoga of translation is very much like the yoga of practice. I mean, it's all about dismantling that thing that obstructs us from all that freeing being. And so it's the same, really, it's the same koan.
Well, that's a beautiful note to stop on then. Thank you so much, Wulstan, Heidi.